I first saw the detour sign on a gray afternoon when the highway was empty and the radio kept losing signal, and I thought it had been left behind from older construction. Because the paint was thin, the arrow bent, and the name beneath it looked older than the guardrail beside it. I took the exit mostly to stretch my legs, and because the road narrowed into trees that stood close enough to lean together, and the air changed in a way that felt like a room being closed, quieter and cooler, with a smell of wet leaves that did not belong to the season. The map on my phone hesitated, then redrew itself, and hesitated again, and when it finally showed a line, it was a line that doubled back on itself, as if the software could not decide where the road should exist. After a mile, I passed a mailbox with no numbers, then a diner that looked closed, but had a light on in the back, and then a stretch of pavement where the center stripe had been painted over so many times that it had become a dull, uneven ridge. I parked at a turnout and walked, noticing how the trees were younger near the road and older farther in, as if the place had been trimmed and then left to grow without anyone checking on it. There was a notice board by the diner door with curled corners and thumbtack holes, and in the middle, a pale rectangle showed where something had been removed, leaving a clean shape that refused to tell me what had been there. Inside, the windows were dusty but not broken, and the tables were set in a way that suggested someone had meant to come back, with chairs pushed in and napkin holders aligned too carefully to be accidental. I did not go far, because the quiet had weight to it, and every small sound, even my shoes, felt like it was being kept and measured by the trees. When I returned to the car, the phone showed a different route, and the same one, and the mileage counter ticked forward without matching the bends I could see. I wrote the town name from the sign in a notebook, and when I looked again, the letters were already fading in my memory, as if I had copied down a word from a dream. By the time I reached the highway, the radio came back, the air warmed, and the exit was gone, leaving only a longer stretch of guardrail and a sense that I had stepped into a place that preferred not to be named. I drove for another hour and kept expecting a familiar landmark to appear, but each mile felt smoothed over. And when I finally stopped for gas, the receipt showed a line for location that was blank, and I realized I had been careful to keep the notebook closed, as if the page inside might change. Asterisk, I did not think about the detour again until a week later. When I unpacked my bag and found a postcard I was certain I had not bought, tucked between a receipt and a folded map, showing a painted main street under a soft summer sky with a small crest in the corner that looked official in the way old town seals do. Simple shapes and a year I could not quite read. The back was blank, except for a thin line where an address would go, and the paper felt older than it should have, not brittle, just handled, as if it had spent time moving between pockets. I tried to search the image, and the results offered me similar streets from different states, none of them matching. And when I typed the name I had written in the notebook, the suggestions changed it to something else every time, as if the letters refused to settle. That afternoon, I went to the county library, because they keep the kind of local histories that never make it online, and the reference desk clerk showed me a shelf of thin binders labeled by year, each one filled with clippings and minutes from meetings that seemed to have been kept by people who believed in writing things down even if no one ever read them. We worked through a decade, then two, and found nothing that matched the crest or the street. And when I asked about older plat maps, she brought out a drawer that stuck and said some of the earlier ones had been digitized and some had not. And sometimes they went missing when the office moved rooms. She said this in the same way someone talks about a pen that walks off without suspicion, just a habit of the world. Before I left, she asked me to write down the town name so she could check later, and when I did, she frowned at the page as if the letters were smudged even though the ink was clean. On the drive home, I stopped at a thrift store I pass often and never enter. And on a rack by the counter, there were 3 more postcards with the same crest. The same main street from different angles, priced at 25 cents each. All of them with blank backs and the same faint line where an address should be. The cashier said they came in a box with kitchenware from an estate, and when I asked whose, she shrugged and said the tag had fallen off. That night I opened the notebook and found that the page with the town name had a light impression but no ink, as if the pen had pressed without writing. And I told myself this was just the way attention works, that it edits and simplifies. But I kept the postcards on the table and noticed how, when I looked away, the crest seemed to lose a detail and then regain it. And I slept badly with the feeling that I had agreed to remember something without knowing what it was by the 3rd week. The small coincidences had begun to line up in a way that made it harder to dismiss them as chance. Not because any one of them was dramatic, but because they kept pointing in the same quiet direction, like footprints that only show when the light is low. I returned to the library and asked for the county clerk's office, and a man there with careful handwriting let me look through a cabinet of withdrawn files, explaining that when records are reclassified or merged, the paper often lingers before someone decides what to do with it. And he said this with the practiced patience of someone who has said it many times. Near the back, between 2 folders with water damage, there was a thin gap where something had been, and the metal tabs showed a faint rust shadow in the exact shape of a staple, as if a document had been there long enough to leave a memory of itself. He told me there had been a relocation of archives years ago, and that some items never quite made the trip. And when I asked for a log of what was missing, he smiled and said missing things do not usually leave a list. On the way out, I noticed a framed photograph of a ribbon cutting for a building that no longer stands, and the plaque beneath it had been replaced, as screws brighter than the wood, and the new text did not say what had been there before. That afternoon, I drove the back roads where the detour should have been, and found only a newer stretch of guardrail and a gravel turnout with tire tracks that curved in and then back out, as if someone had started to stop and changed their mind. My phone traced the same uncertain loop, and the mileage climbed in steady numbers that did not match the landscape. And when I tried to drop a pin, it slid a few yards and settled somewhere else. At a gas station farther south, I asked an older man behind the counter if there had ever been a town between here and the forest, and he said there had been lots of places once, then paused and said he supposed it depended on what you meant by town. He sold me a coffee in a cup with a local logo I did not recognize, and when I asked about it, he said they changed suppliers all the time. That night, I laid the postcards in a row and noticed that each showed the same building in the distance. A low structure with a shallow roof, always just off-center. And in every image, the windows reflected something that was not visible in the street. A pale strip that could have been sky or could have been water. I tried to describe the crest to myself, and could not keep the details straight for more than a minute, and when I wrote them down, the words felt borrowed. The notebook began to fill with careful, ordinary notes that did not quite connect. And I realized I had started checking the door twice before sleeping, not because I expected anything, but because the house felt like it was listening the way the trees had, and I was not sure what it would count as an answer. By the time a month had passed, the pattern had become less about finding new traces, and more about noticing how often the same empty spaces appeared, as if the world were quietly consistent in what it chose not to keep. I began visiting small offices and historical societies along the county line, not with a list, because lists invite corrections, but with the postcards folded into a book, letting people look at them without telling them what I hoped they would say. Some recognized the style and said it looked like a place that could have been anywhere in the Midwest. Others said the crest reminded them of something they could not place. and a few simply handed the cards back with the careful politeness reserved for objects that feel personal. In one records room, a volunteer showed me a cabinet where older plats were kept, and several drawers were labeled in a different hand, the ink darker, as if the labels had been replaced, and inside one drawer, the folders were thinner than they should have been. The metal rails scuffed as though heavier files had once slid there. I noticed the same pale rectangles on walls where frames had been moved, the same newer screws holding newer plaques, and the same way people spoke about changes as if they were weather, not decisions. Driving home, I took a road I do not usually take and passed a low concrete building with a shallow roof that looked like the one in the postcards. Except here the windows were boarded, and the lot had been seeded with grass that grew in a different shade. A neat rectangle that refused to blend with the rest of the field. There was no sign, only a pair of posts where one had been, and the gravel drive ended too cleanly, as if a line had been drawn and respected. My phone did not mark the building, and when I tried to take a picture, the focus drifted toward the trees instead, leaving the structure slightly soft, which I told myself was just light and my own unsteady hand. That night, the notebook page with the town name showed a faint indentation again, deeper than before, as if something had been written there repeatedly and then erased. And the postcards, which I kept in a drawer, were no longer in the order I remembered. I began to wake before my alarm, not with fear, but with the feeling that something ordinary had been moved to a slightly different place. At work, a new map was pinned to the board where an older one had been, and the corners were brighter where the old pins had been, and no one could remember when it had been changed. The gas receipt with the blank location line reappeared in my pocket after I was sure I had thrown it away. None of this proved anything, and that was the trouble, because it also refused to settle into coincidence. I drove the back roads again and again, and each time the mileage disagreed with the turns, and each time the forest seemed to hold its breath in the same places. And I began to understand that the absence itself was the only thing that stayed in the same shape, a careful outline that the rest of the landscape kept stepping around. Asterisk, by early autumn, it was no longer possible to pretend that I was only collecting curiosities, because the work of noticing had started to arrange my days, and the days had begun to arrange themselves around the same small set of roads and offices and drawers. I drove back to the low concrete building with the shallow roof and parked where the gravel ended, and the air there felt flatter, as if the field had been pressed. The boards over the windows were new enough to show clean edges, and the nails had not yet rusted, and the grass inside the neat rectangle grew faster than the rest, a soft, eager green that made the border more obvious. There was a metal box by the door with no markings, and inside it a stack of forms with their headers cut off, leaving only the lines and the boxes where answers should go, and the paper smelled like a basement. I did not take anything, but I stood long enough to notice that the silence there had a rhythm, a pause that repeated like a breath. On the drive away, my phone showed a route that led me back to the same turnout by the forest, and when I tried to override it, the screen dimmed and then brightened as if it were thinking. The diner was still there, still closed, and the light in the back was still on, and the notice board still held its pale rectangle. But now there was a new staple hole slightly off from the old ones, and the wood around it was not yet darkened. I sat in the car and wrote, and the pen pressed without leaving ink for several lines, and when it finally did, the words did not look like mine. At a nearby county office, a clerk I had not met before found a microfilm reel that was not labeled, and when she threaded it, there were minutes from meetings that ended mid-sentence, pages that jumped years without explanation, and then nothing, and she apologized as if the gaps were her fault. Outside, a group of trees had been cut back along the road, and the stumps were fresh, and beyond them, the forest began in the same close way. And for a moment, The space where the trees had been felt like a doorway that had been closed too carefully. That evening, the postcards were back in a stack, but one was missing, and I could not say which, and the crest on the top card had lost a small detail that I was certain had been there before. I slept with the notebook on the table and dreamed of a road that measured itself and came up short. In the morning, the gas receipt with the blank line was on the counter, folded into a shape I did not remember making. I drove again, and the mileage climbed, and the turns repeated, and the place where the exit should have been felt heavier, like a word on the tip of the tongue, and I realized that whatever this was, it was no longer something I could visit and leave, because it had begun to choose the times when I would arrive by winter. The roads had learned me better than I knew them, and the days shortened in a way that made every drive feel like a return, even when I could not say to where. I stopped keeping strict notes, not because the details were gone, but because they no longer held still long enough to be kept. And the notebook pages showed the same faint pressures without ink, the same careful spaces where something had been written and then persuaded to leave. The low concrete building was boarded more thoroughly the next time I passed, and the neat rectangle of grass had spread as if the boundary had been reconsidered, and the posts where a sign had been were gone, leaving 2 clean holes that filled with water and froze. The diner light was finally off, and the windows reflected only trees, and the notice board held 2 pale rectangles now, one older, one new, and the wood between them looked tired. I tried once to drive straight through without stopping, and found myself at the same gas station, holding a cup with a logo I still could not name, and a receipt that still would not tell me where I was. The clerk was different, or perhaps only older, and when I asked about the road he said some routes are seasonal, and smiled as if that explained more than it did. At home, the postcards had thinned to 2, and then to 1, and then to a space in the drawer that held the shape of a stack, and a crest, when I tried to describe it, would not agree with itself. The library shelves had been shifted, and the thin binders I remembered were gone, replaced by newer ones with heavier spines, and the cabinet of withdrawn files had been moved. Or perhaps I had only learned a better way to walk past it. Once, late in the afternoon, I saw the detour sign again, or something that stood where it should have been, and I slowed and felt the car drift as if the road were slightly crowned. And then there was only guardrail and trees that leaned together in the same quiet way. The mileage on the dash continued its steady counting, and I realized that what it measured was no longer distance. The notebook stayed closed, and that felt like a decision, and not one I had made. I still wake before my alarm, and sometimes I find the receipt folded on the counter, and sometimes I do not, and neither seems to matter in the way it once did. When people ask where I have been driving, I give them names that exist, and they nod, and the world keeps its reasonable face. There is a place, I think, that is easier to step around than to stand in, and the landscape is very good at learning such things. If I pass the forest now, it does not feel like it is listening, and that is the only change I can be sure of, because the quiet no longer waits for an answer.